added to a slab of dough to create flaky layers, whipped for chewy, tender cookies, or simply whipped until so pale that it coats cakes. Butter is the most often called for fat in bakes. Hey there, my name is Sylvie and I am a baker who has been studying the science and fundamentals of this industry whilst also spending many hours in the kitchen baking up things for my website roamingtaste.com. Welcome back to my channel where we are diving into butter, the most popular type of fat that has lasted throughout history for good reason. In last week's episode, we dove into the types of butter, explaining things from clarified, whipped, or brown. If you have an interest and haven't seen that episode or listened, please go back to that episode. Otherwise, this week we are diving into butter in the various types of baked goods that it is most often called for, how it affects those goods, and some tips and tricks that might help you bake better. Butter in enriched dough. Enriched dough is effectively richer than standard flour, water, yeast, and salt dough. It involves some form of fat such as butter or oil, eggs, milk, and or sugar. Most enriched doughs will include more than one of these, such as butter, eggs, and sugar, or butter, eggs, milk, and sugar. If you have ever made or bought brioche, babka, hot cross buns, cinnamon rolls, or the ever popular Thanksgiving side, dinner rolls.
Do you like a dinner roll?
Then you've enjoyed enriched dough bread. According to The Perfect Loaf, butter in bread dough tenderizes the dough, making the soft pull-apart texture of bakes like brioche, dinner rolls, and Pullman loaves. As fat inhibits starch recrystallization, bread that includes butter will stay soft longer, increasing the loaf's shelf life. There are effectively 3 stages to dough development. The first, shaggy dough stage, where it is a messy mixture, and the last is the full, smooth, round ball of dough. The middle phase is where it has been kneaded for several minutes, where the dough should be strengthened enough to pass the window pane test before butter is added, and the butter should be added to dough slowly, each small amount mixed in entirely before moving on to the next piece. There are a couple of things to note with your dough. If you're hand kneading, it is best to warm up the milk even if using instant yeast, as the dough won't warm up by hand kneading as it would using an electric mixer and dough hook. And the temperature of your butter is key. It should be room temperature but cool to the touch, as butter that is too cold will not form into the dough but likely tear it, whilst butter that is too warm will create a greasy mixture that likely won't form a cohesive dough. A side note from the article, The Butter Mistake That Could Be Ruining Your Brioche, where Nathan Myhrvold, founder of Modernist Cuisine, notes, it's no accident that brioche and many enriched breads contain eggs. They have properties that help pull ingredients together. So if you are using a brioche dough and you're not vegan and the recipe doesn't call for eggs, you could try an experiment by simply omitting like a 1/4 cup of water or milk and adding an egg and making 2 types of enriched dough. So making the regular standard recipe and then making it by doing that change that I just suggested, one with eggs and one without, and seeing the difference that this makes to the overall texture and flavor of your bread. One last element we'll look at is the quantity of butter in an enriched dough. As per the article How to Master Brioche and Unlock a Whole World of Baking, there are no hard and fast rules for making brioche, but in general the butter is typically anywhere from 30 to 70% of the flour weight. As brioche is one element of enriched dough, some recipes for enriched dough will call for a butter percentage as low as 5 to 15%. A wee side note here. The percentage referenced is commonly known as a baker's percentage amongst professionals. This refers to all ingredients in relation to the flour quantity. Flour is always 100%, and the other ingredients come in as percentages to that amount. So if you have 1 kilo or 2.2 pounds of flour in a recipe and it calls for 500 grams or 1.1 pounds of butter, that is technically 50% butter to flour ratio. Finally, before we finish up on enriched doughs, the butter mistake that could be ruining your brioche notes, it's also helpful to chill the dough overnight if you can before shaping it and putting it in the oven. Laminated dough. The term pastry is varied here, so I'm going to break it down with different types of pastry. The easiest place to start is with the most famous pastry of all, laminated dough, which creates beloved croissants, pain au raisins, and most of the flaky baked goods you know and love. In the book, Understanding Baking, the Art and Science of Baking by Joseph Amendola and Nicole Rees, a dough de triomphe, whose primary ingredients are flour, water, and salt, is wrapped around a block of cool but malleable butter, the barrage. Puff pastry and Danish pastry consist of roughly equal amounts of weight of butter to flour. And Samin Nosrat beautifully describes laminated dough in her book Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. A flaky dough is wrapped around a large slab of butter. This dough and butter sandwich is rolled out and then folded back upon itself in a process called a turn. Classic puff pastry, when turned 6 times, will have precisely 730 layers of dough separated by 729 layers of butter. Upon entering a hot oven, each one of those distinct layers of butter will turn to steam, creating 730 layers of flakes. It's crucial when making laminated doughs that the fat and workspace remain cold so the butter does not melt, though the butter must be soft enough to roll into a slab. Most home bakers are unlikely to try and make their own laminated dough for homemade croissants, particularly when you consider how cheap it is to buy a packet of frozen croissants or even ready baked ones. I've personally never made croissants, but I have made Franzbrötchen or German cinnamon rolls, which take their inspiration from laminated dough, but they are a bit more approachable for the home baker. So they have a laminated style dough, but it doesn't take 3 days either. It does take several hours. So there is a requirement of rolling butter out to a large and even square to then add to the dough. The easiest way to do this is to weigh out your butter and place it in parchment paper that can be folded over and enclose your butter completely on all sides. This helps you then create the size you need for your dough whilst also creating a nice even edge and height to your block. As it's completely covered, you can pop it into the fridge until you're ready to use it. Over and over again, the key feature in creating a great laminated dough is the temperature of the butter.
Butter's too cold. The butter is too cold!
And the need to rest the dough. As Chef Trung Vu, chef instructor of pastry and baking arts at the Institute of Culinary Education in New York City, advises, the goal is for it to become flexible when laminating, but not warm it up and have it melt or leach out of the dough. If your butter warms up too much while you are working with the dough, letting it rest for 5 to 10 minutes covered in the refrigerator can be extremely helpful. Often in life, when we're doing something, whether baking, finishing up that task for our job, spending time with people, we are actively aware that we have a time limit to it because there is something else we need to get to. Sometimes we're not fully present mentally, and if we choose to make laminated dough, we have to be fully present mentally and also respect the process and the time it's going to take. There is no speeding up, there is no hacking this process for the best result. And this is just something to be mindful of if we're going to give it a go. In the book Understanding Baking, the Art and Science of Baking by Joseph Amendola and Nicole Rees, they take a balanced approach and recognize the different type of fats you can use in laminated pastries and how they affect the overall flavor and texture when used. Although butter is certainly the first choice for a great tasting pastry, it doesn't necessarily make the highest or flakiest pastry. Lard, along with hydrogenated vegetable shortenings and hard margarines designed to be rolled into laminate doughs, possess large fat crystals that contribute to the flaking effect. Lard and shortening have a lower water content than butter, meaning that an equal amount by weight will provide more fat and therefore create a more tender flaky product. When cooled, pastry made with shortenings may leave a waxy aftertaste owing to the higher melting point of the fat. Butter with its mouth-friendly low melting point will not. It's important to consider what you want to achieve if you're consider making your own laminated pastry, so having this wider picture is helpful. Finally, quoting once again from the book Understanding Baking, The Art and Science of Baking by Joseph Amendola and Nicole Rees, working with butter which has a narrow temperature range for ideal handling requires more precision to be sure, but produces superior flavor. Pie and short crust pastry. The key, absolute key when we speak about butter in pastries for pies, tarts, or quiches is cold butter. In her book Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, Samin Nosrat explains why the temperature matters when making the best pie or short crust pastry. Keep butter cold in order to preserve its emulsion and prevent it from interacting with the proteins in flour when making doughs for flaky pastries, because the warmer and hence softer your butter, the more readily it will combine with the flour. Because fat inhibits gluten development, the more intimately the two ingredients combine, the more tender, not flaky a dough will be. To prevent gluten from developing, keep butter cold. And Paula Fagoni in her book How Baking Works suggests whenever possible work the fat into the dough with your fingertips instead of using a mixer, since mixers quickly overblend fat with flour. Be sure water added is chilled so it doesn't melt the fat, and chill the dough before rolling. A lot of professionals recommend pressing butter into the pastry with your fingers because you can work quickly to create the right texture before adding in your cold or ice water, and in the case of some short crust pastries, before that egg is added to create a more tender dough. Working quickly helps create that perfect tender dough. Once made, it's best to chill our dough to rest for at least ideally an hour, and as Samin Nosrat once again says in her book Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, a wonderful, wonderful book, roll out a properly made pie dough and you'll see the chunks of butter. When you slide the pie into a hot oven, the cold pieces of butter and trapped air and steam from the water released by the butter all push apart the layers of dough to create flakes. Additionally, it is best once you've rolled out your dough to do an additional resting of 20 to 30 minutes, ideally chilling it before baking, because this can also make a huge difference in the flakiness of your pastry. It's important to mention the classic French short crust pastry, pâte brisée, which dates back to the Middle Ages and is both flaky and sturdy rather than crumbly, as per Wikipedia there. And quoting once again from Paula Fagoni's book, How Baking Works, French chefs achieve this texture through frisage, a process in which fat and flour are kneaded with the heel of the hand until they are thoroughly blended. This is the pastry which is used in dishes from beloved quiche à Lorraine to berry tarts or galettes. It's as versatile as a standard pie dough, though the resting time is best for several hours or even 24 hours before then being used in a recipe.
This must be where pies go when they die.
Choux pastry. Choux is a completely different type of pastry than a pie or laminated dough. Butter and water are heated together to a boil before swiftly stirring in flour, and then eggs to create a smooth dough that can be baked into a variety of dishes, from cream puffs to chocolate eclairs to cheese puffs, to name just a few there. In the mixing phase, butter helps create a smooth texture between the water and flour, whilst adding flavor and color to the baked pastry. If you want to replace butter and choux, it's best to try with margarine with a fat content above 80%, as that's similar to butter and should provide the same structure to the baked goods, though the flavor could be affected. Cookies. When speaking about cookies, I'm most specifically speaking about the main types of beloved chewy and slightly crispy on the edges and soft and tender in the center ones. Most recipes will call for either room temperature or melted butter, though some might call for softened. So let's define room temperature butter, as that definition isn't clear. What room temperature butter actually means is that the butter is cool to the touch, and when pressed, it leaves an indent, but it isn't so soft that your finger goes through or slides off it. If a recipe calls for room temperature butter and your butter is softened, it's actually best to pop it back into the fridge for like 10 minutes to firm up somewhat. When you whip butter and sugar, water in the butter will be attracted to the sugar, helping to introduce more air, whilst the sugar dissolves into the butter to create a really cohesive base to the best cookies. Most great cookie recipes will require you to whip the butter and sugar for around 2 to 3 minutes. And if you've ever wondered why, it's because it takes 2 to 3 minutes for the reaction of the sugar to dissolve into the butter and the fluffiness between the two to form nice and cohesively as the base for the additional ingredients for our perfect cookie texture. Room temperature butter alongside room temperature eggs gives cookies that soft texture, and the fat contributes to the tender and rich flavor whilst ensuring that those cookies spread nice and evenly whilst baking. Most often you'll see a recipe requires room temperature butter versus melted, and this is because it makes it easier to whip up with sugar and gives the cookies their nice rise. Cookies made with melted butter tend to be flatter and crispier because when butter is melted, that emulsion is broken and it can't be repaired. A side note here for butter cookies like shortbread, because these have a completely different signature texture to the cookie that I've been speaking about.
Some shortbread? It's Scottish like you are.
Shortbread has a standard ratio of 3 parts flour to 2 parts butter to 1 part sugar. Though some recipes call for cornstarch, or also known as corn flour, or salt, the overall ratio should still be around that 3 parts flour to 2 parts butter to 1 part sugar. Many of the shortest recipes, such as shortbread cookies, call for a very soft or even melted butter in order to encourage this now fluid fat to quickly coat individual flour particles, preventing gluten webs from forming. These doughs are often soft enough to press into the pan. Shortbread biscuits are incredibly different from standard cookies in that they almost solely rely on butter for moisture. They should be incredibly pale when baked, and they should have a nice smooth exterior but somewhat of a crunch when being consumed. Most recipes will recommend you whip the butter and sugar until pale and fluffy, kind of similar to a standard cookie recipe, though some will call for the butter to be melted. According to a Serious Eats article before their own recipe for shortbread, that as cookies bake, the air pockets begin to swell with steam, a gentle upwards draft that helps hold the dough aloft. When the cookie finally sets, the air's footprint forms its crumb, and Loki Foods states, when cooled, the fat resolidifies, locking in that snap to melt texture. Thanks to those minimal ingredients and all that butter means the dough pre-baking should be soft enough to shape, and once baked to a light pale color can even be cut into individual pieces, meaning it's still soft. Some would recommend never replacing the butter with margarine, but you do you. Cakes. Hoping to ground herself, Rosie closed her eyes and thought of butter, the way other people probably pictured relaxing tropical idyls. Her favorite thing in the world was creaming butter and sugar, watching the way two disparate ingredients come together to form something new. She could picture it in her mind, back in the kitchen at home. The soft pale yellow of the butter, the old wooden spoon, and the cracked brown mixing bowl. Butter was magic. The starting point for cookies and cake and pie and muffins and everything good. By Stephanie Kate Strom. Love a la mode. Round cakes, layer cakes, loaf cakes. Most cakes call for butter as its base fat, particularly if it's a vanilla cake base, where butter is a complementary ingredient to the texture and flavor. Like with pastry, the temperature of our butter matters, with most cake recipes calling for room temperature butter. Once again, quoting from Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat by Samin Nosrat, butter at room temperature is more pliable, allowing air to be worked into it to lighten cakes or to combine more readily with flour, sugar, and eggs for tender cakes. Like the temperature of our butter, the speed of whipping is essential, as found in the book on baking by Sarah Lubinsky, Priscilla A. Martell, and Eddie Von Dame. For butter cakes, the fat should be creamed at low to moderate speeds to prevent raising its temperature. If our butter is too soft or we whip too swiftly, which I have to admit is something I have done so many times, because I'm like, it doesn't really matter as long as I whip it, right? I'm whipping it for 3 minutes. It doesn't matter how fast I'm doing it. that I'm just like speeding up the process, but actually there is no speeding up the process because it's science and the process is going to take as long as it takes, but it might also offset the work we're doing as it bakes because we tried to speed up the process. If our butter is too soft or we mix too swiftly and warm it too much, the results in the air bubbles we create during that whipping phase will be likely to collapse and leave us with heavy or soggy cakes. Most cake recipes that have a creaming method will call to whip the butter with the sugar, which is explained by the Institute of Culinary Education. This emulsion is essential for creating stability in the dough. It allows for steam and carbon dioxide to be trapped in the batter as it bakes, which causes your cake to rise. The butter also helps to create a light and tender texture in cake batter. When making a cake, it is important to mix the butter well, particularly if it is a cake that relies heavily on the butter for flavor and texture, like a butter cake. So if a recipe calls for you to whip for 3 minutes, don't try to do it for less or try and speed it up by whipping at a higher speed because it can affect the overall outcome. The same temperature requirement also applies for recipes where you whip the butter into the dry ingredients, a process called reverse creaming. Basically, by coating the recipe's flour with butter, this method limits gluten development. Too much gluten development can make cakes tough, so this buttery coating acts as a safety net to prevent that from occurring with too much mixing. Quoting from King Arthur Baking. There are so many layers to how butter affects a tender vanilla or plain cake's flavor and texture. It's the best fat for those styles of cakes, whereas most chocolate, zucchini, or carrot cakes, for example, will call for oil, as that's the best fat for these denser cakes that require a different level of hydration and is also complementary in flavor to those ingredients. Additionally, as per the article, Why We Love to Bake with Oil Instead of Butter Sometimes, by Epicurious notes, a butter cake will firm up in the refrigerator, so for the best taste and texture, you have to let it come to room temperature, which can take over an hour. Oil cake, it's pretty much good to go straight from the fridge. This can be helpful if you've found a great recipe but want to use butter in place of oil or vice versa, but factoring in how it'll be served, etc., might make you reevaluate, though it's always best to make a recipe as recommended for best results. Lastly, one additional note when we are making loaf cakes. You might have noticed that some bakers, myself included, place a line of butter down the center of the loaf prior to baking, which is explained in the Salon article, The Bake-Off Guide to Loaf Cakes. This allows it to stay moist there, and it will leave you with an even central crack in your cake where all the expansion happened. Effectively, when you're baking a loaf cake, there's a smaller area for the cake to rise, meaning it can be quite uneven. So you're guiding the cake how to rise nice and evenly during the baking phase for a more aesthetic dessert. But if you're topping with a frosting, you could just forego that step altogether. There are a few factors to consider when using butter or oil. Firstly, if butter is called for but it's melted, and then it's doing the job of oil in the mixing stage but adding the perfect complementary flavor once it's baked, and it's also going to firm up more because obviously oil is liquid at room temperature whereas butter is not. If a recipe you have calls for butter but you want to use oil or vice versa, it's better to find a specific recipe that uses the fat you prefer instead of amending one that you love and risking the recipe not turning out. Buttercream. There's a whole episode I want to do about buttercreams because there is so much to say. But a key of buttercream is, you guessed it, butter. Buttercream tends to be made with room temperature butter as it needs to be whipped to form a nice cohesive smooth mixture, as Paula Fagoni notes in her How Baking Works book. The best temperature for creaming butter is generally within the narrow range of 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 to 21 degrees Celsius. This is to say that you want the butter to be room temperature or softened, but not too soft, that it appears melty or overly greasy on the exterior, quoting from Erin Jean McDowell there. Most buttercreams rely on other ingredients to give them stability, as butter's minimal temperature window means that it can't handle warmer temperatures when it's left out. So it's important to consider the context your buttercream is needed for, such as American buttercream on top of a cookie base or brownies that you're making. It will be in the fridge for a few hours, and then you're taking it to a potluck where it will be once again stored in the fridge and then served within an hour or so after being removed. That is absolutely fine. Whereas Swiss meringue buttercream is ideal for decorating a wedding cake that will be consumed after sitting out for several hours, where it will remain stable at room temperature. The beauty of buttercream is that it can be made ahead and stored in an airtight container in the fridge for up to 1 week or in the freezer for up to 3 months for later use. So if you ever have buttercream left over and you don't have anything to do with it, don't chuck it, put it in a container and freeze it if you have space, I guess. If you want to make buttercream without butter, it's best to source a recipe using margarine or one that is without it versus amending a buttercream recipe you already have, particularly as buttercream tends to use a lot of resources such as egg whites or sugar, and so it's best to find something instead of trialing and then ending up wasting a lot of resources. Final thoughts on butter and baking. Whenever we use butter in our baking, we want to consider what its effects are and why it's being called for that specific temperature. What is it doing within that? And if we don't know, that's okay, but then we need to outsource that knowledge to the professional that's calling for whatever they're saying in that recipe. They know better than us, we're just following their instructions in this scenario. It's also important to consider how butter affects a recipe when we remove it as an ingredient. As stated in the book How Baking Works by Paula Fagoni, when fats are removed from baked goods, flavors become disjointed and the baked good doesn't taste as rich and full flavored. Fats probably affect taste perception because many flavors dissolve in them. If you want to make a recipe without any type of fat, I'm going to suggest the same advice I keep giving. Find a recipe that you can follow that meets that requirement. There are so many recipes online now that you don't need to try amending your favorites and risk wasting time and resources for a result that doesn't have guaranteed success. Fats in our bodies. The buttering is done, something that is to be set about with extreme generosity. The bun must be placed back under the grill in order for the butter to melt. Perfection is when you manage to catch the bun just as the butter has formed a golden pool yet retains a patch of glistening, soft but not yet liquid butter at its center. A shining golden coin in the middle of your bun. By Nigel Slater, 1,000 Feasts, Small Moments of Joy, a memoir of sorts about hot cross buns. Obviously, butter is a fat, and we've discussed at length the many ways it affects the baking recipes it's used in. Though it's also important to recognize that fat is overtly characterized as a villain in most societies, and most of us have little to no understanding of how it plays into our biological makeup to make us healthy. This is particularly important with the rise of non-FDA approved Ozempic and other GLP-1 weight loss drugs, also known as semaglutides. Most of us have only lived in a world where thin is the epitome of beauty. Well, thin, but not too thin, as one of the girls in my high school found for her naturally thin frame and the incessant name calling she received. The attitude of thin equals hot isn't actually how it has always been, as found in this article thanks to the Culinary Institute of America. Prior to the Progressive Era, 1897 to 1920, thinness was understood to be an issue tied to poor health and poverty, and large bodies symbolized wealth and good health. By the start of the 20th century, however, thinness was both idealized and tied to a national morality that promoted self-control and the regulation of one's body. Culturally, regardless of our natural body's frame, the genes that dictate our bone size, features, and skin color, we must always want to be lean, eat less, and or feel guilt, around food. Add in the fact we're well aware that the global epidemic of obesity and its increasing rate puts a great economic burden on societies. Medication-based treatment of obesity and drugs such as semaglutide may halve the costs depending on the other comorbidities. However, some studies came to the conclusion that the use of semaglutide just for weight loss is not cost effective. Quoting there from a National Library of Medicine article, Semaglutide in the Real World Attitudes of the Population. In a Brown University article, What are Healthy Fats and Why Do You Need Fat in Your Diet?, advises us that fat is a necessary part of our diet and is required for many functions in your body. In fact, fat is needed to absorb and store key vitamins. Vitamins A, D, E, and K all require dietary intake of fat for proper absorption and storage. Because of the dialogue around consuming fats or the societal views on overweight individuals all being negative, which is very much reflected in statistics, with people who are overweight being less likely to be hired, promoted, as well as a slew of other sociological elements. When some people actively avoid consuming any fat in their diet, it can lead to poor eyesight, bone density issues, problem with the nervous system, poor skin health, and bleeding risks. The lesson here is pretty clear that we need fat as human beings for everyday function, but as part of a balanced diet, which sometimes feels like a cop-out to say because it's a statement that can have multiple meanings because no two people's balanced diets are the same. I personally hate the sentiment of food being seen as bad or even being used as a reward because it's essential for life. I know the use of the word hate there is particularly strong, but there is no other way to cut through the fact that most of us have been incorrectly taught that food is either something to hold against us or to celebrate us as a reward. When food is associated beyond its necessity for us, it can easily and quickly be manipulated in a negative way. So many people grew up having to eat their plate clean or consume 3 meals a day whether they were hungry or not. And so these habits end up deeply embedded into our psyche, and without the act of learning to listen to our body and when it is hungry, we can naturally find ourselves in an unhealthy relationship with food. With the rise of semaglutides and the ease of access to these products that help us lose weight, there isn't a lot of room to mentally heal or realign our relationship with food. Some people absolutely need these medications, sure. However, the fact so many people who are a healthy size are leaning into taking these medications for the weight loss benefits speaks to a wider problem in society regarding food. Such as, if someone tells you to reach for a low-fat anything, you should ask yourself why that is. Why is something low-fat considered better than regular fat? Particularly when so many low-fat products contain higher levels of sugar than a regular fat product. We live in a capitalist world where messages around food are directed at us with studies and articles that don't always paint a full picture of a balanced diet. Ultimately, if we can train ourselves to lean into eating more fruits, vegetables, and legumes, as well as organic meats and tofu, then that hot cross bun that Nigel Slater was quoted at the start of this chapter on a Saturday morning slathered with butter isn't going to be a problem. It's just going to be something that we consume. In the LitHub article, What We Know and Don't Know About Fat, fats direct and guide critical aspects of mammalian biology, activating or suppressing genes that govern metabolism and immunity. They can influence whether we are happy or sad, thinking clearly, or wading through mental fog. And in terms of the fats in meat and dairy, it matters what the animals in the human diet consume, for what they eat, we become. Ultimately, if we're consuming butter, we want it to come from animals that are living their best lives, not just for our consumption, but we want them to be so happy that they actually produce more milk. And that is most often not done on an industrial scale, but rather with smaller farms who know their animals and can care for them properly. In an ideal world, we would all have access to suppliers who provide those minimal things for the animals which would would not only make our food taste that much better because the product is going to be that much better, but with the reality of food deserts becoming ever more present, where people are lucky if they can access food stores actually selling fresh produce, as most of those major chains who run these stores in these areas only sell food in refrigerators, we all just have to work with what we've got and remember that food is neither a villain nor a hero. Butter as a status symbol. Butter as a status symbol. I shouldn't think even millionaires could eat anything nicer than new bread and real butter and honey for a tea by Dodie Smith in I Capture the Castle. Want butter colour cookware, a mixer, a scent, clothing, a bag, and actually in London, England, you can go to one of the best bars in the city and drink a cocktail made with butter. No lies, I've actually had it on more than one occasion. Also, butter coloured nail polish. It seems only too perfect for this final chapter to be about butter as a status symbol, particularly with the quiet rise it's had in the 2020s. I say quiet rise because it's not until we really stop and pay attention to the way it has entered so many areas of our society that butter has become something we should crave, show off, and create into something where it's suddenly a statement. We had butter boards in 2022, butter sculptures at weddings in 2024, and in 2025, butter was the color of the year, appearing seemingly everywhere we looked. Apparently, some mothers are also feeding their babies sticks of butter, and this all speaks to it being an ingredient that references you as having a status, particularly a sense of wealth. In a world where we all aspire to something more, even if that something more is the basics of life because food is so expensive, it becomes clear how easily it can be turned into a status symbol. This is really notable with the increased cost of butter going from being affordable to literally being an item of luxury. During COVID, it became apparent how striking the cost increase was when a discounted block of butter was suddenly equal to what had been the full cost price pre-COVID. Add in the shrinkflation, where a standard block has most likely gone down in size whilst the price has either stayed the same or risen. Food as a status symbol is nothing new. But in our oversaturated world of advertising, it's becoming more obvious at how brands and the wealthier classes can use their excessive wallets to use food as props or inspiration for the few to enjoy, whilst the tightened wallets of the many go without or have to use something like Klarna or Afterpay to buy groceries with. As mentioned in the article, this summer the vibe is butter. In a world where everything is commodified, access to scarcity is one of the only remaining luxuries. I mean, if that's not offensive. In the taste article, Butter, the Softest Flex, Flora, whose name matches the subject matter perfectly, writes, consumer reports point to a heightened interest in premium butter as part of the little luxury movement, a pursuit of small affordable indulgences, and marketing budgets are increasing accordingly. Why is this ingredient having such a moment in the 2020s? There are layers to the reasons, from less disposable income to comfort factor and nostalgia. Most of us grew up eating toast slathered with butter and jam. Its simplicity tells us that no matter what's happening outside our door or how little control we have on the state of the world, we can still reach for something that will fill our bones with comfort. This is also reflected in the fact millennials and Gen Z will die poorer, included me, will die poorer than previous generations, but are the largest generations to splurge on the luxuries of food. Maybe because we don't have that second room where we can laze about. We understand how even the private act of what we eat is no longer a private activity, and everything we do, consume, own, or even rent tells the world who we are, both in real life and in our curated online lives. Barbara Kafka, food consultant and cookbook author, puts it perfectly in this 1980s or early 1990s article from the New York Times. The food you purchase is a reflection of your position in society, and it's a way to upgrade the image of yourself. In the article, Why Butter Became 2025's Most Unexpected food trend. We also see how butter plays into multiple elements, whether we're aware of it or not, such as with nails, you know? It is a color that signals comfort, tradition, and a specific vision of home. The aesthetic and the ingredient reinforce each other, creating a feedback loop in which butter becomes both a visual and culinary signifier of a particular kind of abundance. The theory holds that consumers turn to affordable luxuries during uncertain times as small acts of self-care and control. Butter offers something rare: abundance without apology. It is one of the few indulgences that feels both attainable and justified, a full fat yes in a landscape of expensive no's. I've already mentioned in my bakery video that with the cost of living being what it is, we're more likely to spend the minimal money we have for joy on smaller purchases like goods from independent bakeries or even such as ingredients such as butter. A Medium article, From Quiet Luxury to Quiet Eating, How Food Became the New Status Symbol, the poorest households now spend 50% more of their disposable income on food than the richest, from a Resolution Foundation article in 2023. Yet online, we're told that the real secret to good eating is effort, not money. Being able to afford butter is the same kind of marker as was sold by the media a few years ago, that those who cooked their own meals cared more about their families than those who didn't. Whereas this involves having time and money, something those with less disposable incomes tend to have less of because they need more jobs to keep a roof over their head. The richest 1%, or 3,000 people, including pop stars Beyonce, Taylor Swift, and Selena Gomez, hold more wealth than the remaining 8 billion people. Butter being a marker of social status is particularly relevant when we consider two events that took place in 2025. One was a trip for influencers to Ireland for Kerrygold butter, and another was held at one hotel in San Francisco in August 2025. Plugra butter is one of the most popular butters in the United States for professionals or home bakers thanks to its high quality. On this particular day, according to their own Instagram, they didn't throw a party, we launched a concept and committed to it. Some lucky influencers were invited, and one of the centerpieces included a butter cake stacked high to show that they have so much money to spend for an event that caters to a chosen few. Plugra butter retails between 20 to 50% higher than standard American butters, by the way, and obviously they're a butter brand, so they can do whatever they want with the money they have and their product. But Madison Brown recently did a great video, Food is the New Quiet Luxury, and sums it up pretty well.
Once people start using excessive amounts of food as simple decor, you know something's going on in the economy and the world, like something's messed up. And maybe, you know, they could have done this 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and it wouldn't have been such a big deal, but it is a big deal because now there's people who can barely afford groceries, bitches can't even buy eggs without their account going negative. Like, we are really in the trenches right now. And so it's kind of giving let them eat cake
or let them eat butter. We don't have to be rich to slather a piece of bread with this ingredient that is the type of hazy yellow you get at the height of a summer evening. Really, what is life without some bread and butter to remind us that the beauty of simplicity is making us feel rich regardless of what's in our bank account? I think that is all I have to say on butter. Though I've probably left a couple of things out, please don't hate me. I do all of the research. There is no AI used in my scripts. This script was 13,000 words. That's why it had to be broken down into 2 parts, because butter is so incredibly a part of our lives and there are so many facets to it. This is such an unassuming ingredient, but there are so many layers to butter that we don't really understand unless we really stop. Please do like, share, and subscribe so that I can keep making more videos like this. I'd love for this content to be seen by more people so that this channel can grow. I would love to make more episodes about the ingredients we use and the desserts we love. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. Ka kite ano and Choux.
God, I love butter sauce. There's nothing bad about it.
Buttered toast, please.
Where's the butter?